Welcome, students. We are beginning with T S Eliot, Practical Criticism, New Criticism, and his essay, Tradition and Individual Talent, prescribed for our study. But before that, this small session is for the small, brief biography of T S Eliot before we actually begin to look at the theories and the background and influences on T S Eliot through which he developed his theory of impersonal poetry and objective correlative. So let's have a very quick look at the biography of T S Eliot. Eliot is the winner of Nobel Prize in Literature, and he is considered to be one of the giants of modern literature, who is highly distinguished as a poet, literary critic, dramatist, editor, and publisher. We have to keep this in mind that he was a critic and a poet. And these traits overlapped. Whenever he was talking in poetry, the critic in him was dominant or prevalent. And whenever he was a critic, the poet in him could be seen. For the BA Part 2, the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock has been prescribed, and this was written when he was still in college. And out of the many poems, this also is considered to be a landmark poem in the history of literature. Now, when he was in college, when he was writing poetry, he articulated very distinct modern themes, and form also was a very modern theme, which was seen as a striking development or a very clear departure from those of 19th century poetry. And within a few years, when he composed the poem Gerentian, and within a decade, when he wrote the most influential poems of the century, The Wasteland, the origin of Wasteland is considered to be part personal. The voices projected are universal. This is the most beautiful aspect of the poem. And Eliot later denied that he had a large cultural problems in mind, but nevertheless, we see that in The Wasteland, he actually diagnosed the malaise of the generation and the Western civilizations of the 20th century. Eliot's poetic writing, or the poems, the important poems which are collectively as Four Quarters, East Cocker, Dry Salvages, Little Gidding, these are the popular poems by Eliot. He is known as a literary critic and also as a poet. We discussed this, but from 1916 through 1921, he had contributed approximately 100 reviews and articles to various periodicals. So, this was the kind of output that Eliot produced as a critic. His ideas, we can say, that quickly solidified into doctrines and became, along with the essays of I.A. Richards, the basis of new criticism. We will discuss the salient features of new criticism, its growth, development in our next session. Now, I.A. Richards, who is considered to be the most influential persons of the schools of literary study, and almost half a century of critical writing, Eliot concerned himself more or less with the positions regarding his concerns as a critic. And in the beginning of 1920s, late 1920s, Eliot's criticism was supplemented by religious and social criticism, and in his writings, such as The Idea of Christian Society, we see that he is deeply involved and thoughtful. He talks like a Christian poet in the process of making sense of the world between the two world wars, because this was a period between the two world wars. And these writings, when we read them, it's perceived that he's suggesting the dilemma of the serious observer of the Western culture of the 1930s. And it can be rightly understood because they complement his poetry, plays, and literary journalism whatsoever. Eliot, we see that he is also an important figure in the 20th century drama. He was inclined to the theatre in his early poems because his earlier poems are essentially dramatic. And many of his earlier essays and reviews are on drama or dramatists. But by the mid of 1920s, he was writing a play, Sweeney Agnostus, which was published in 1932. And in 1930 also, he wrote an ecclesiastical pageant, The Rock. and two full blown plays, Murder in the Cathedral, which became a popular one, and The Family Reunion. And in the late 1940s and 50s, he devoted exclusively to plays. The Cocktail Party is among those, which became very popular. His goal was to revitalize the poetic drama and seeing it in terms of consistency with the modern age. He was one such poet and playwright who experimented with language, very close to the contemporary speech. He said that essentially poetic and language should be capable of spiritual, emotional, and intellectual resonances. So his work has influenced several important 20th century playwrights, including W.H. Auden and Pinter. Eliot has made significant contributions as an editor and publisher, and we see that from 1922 to 1939, he was the editor of a major intellectual journal, The Criterion. And from 1925 to 65, he was an editor director to the publishing house of Faber and Faber, a very famous publishing house. And in both capacities, he worked behind the scenes to nurture the intellectual and spiritual life of his times. When we look at his education and the background, when he was an undergraduate at Harvard, Eliot emphasized language and literature, Latin, Greek, German, French, whatsoever. But in the far reaching consequence of his undergraduate career was that he accidentally discovered the symbolist movement in literature. And this book, he claimed, had changed the course of his life. He read this book by Arthur Symons, Symbolist Movement in Literature, and he himself confessed that it has changed the course of his life. Now, first, Symons introduced him to the poetry of Lafarge and Baudelaire. And from Lafarge, we see that Eliot learned how to handle emotion in poetry. We can read this in detail because reading the influences on Eliot as a critic will be very important for us to understand his theory of impersonality and objective correlative, because when we talk about his theory of objective correlative and impersonality, we see that it has been highly influenced by Imagist movement and some great figures like Lafarge and Baudelaire. So he said that from them I learned how to handle emotion in poetry through irony and the quality of detachment. This is what impersonality that enabled him to see himself and his emotions essentially as objects for analysis. And he himself says that from Baudelaire, he learned how to use sordid images of the modern city, the material at hand in poetry, whatever realism or realistic situations were available to him, and which were of greater consequence. And he learned something of the nature of good and evil in modern life. Secondly, Symons stimulated Eliot to take a course on French literary criticism from Irving Babbitt. Babbitt was one man who nurtured Eliot's budding Francophilia, his dislike for Romanticism. Now, it's not exactly the dislike of Romanticism, but he's very opposite to what the Romantics said, and the Romantic revival and the literary theory brought about by Wordsworth in his preface to Lyrical Ballads. And therefore, he developed a taste or a tendency to appreciate tradition. Now, these tastes are very clearly evident in most of his early literary criticism. During the year, we say that when Eliot spent time at Sorbonne in Paris, he came to know about the Roman Catholic philosopher Charles Maurras. And this was of greater significance because when he attended the lectures of Henry Bergson in the process, he developed reflections on time and consciousness, which are explored in his early poetry. And this is also explicit in his poem, The Four Quatrains. Paris is considered to be a place which was very important in the development of Eliot's urban imagination. This we have to remember that Paris plays a very important role in the urban imagination or in shaping the urban imagination of T S Eliot. And Eliot took advantage of popular arts, opera, ballet, and of museums of Paris, and most of he observed, or rather absorbed, in the images of urban life, which can be seen on the back streets along the river Seine. Now, near the end of his year in Paris, Eliot visited London for the first time, and before he returned home, he also visited northern Italy and Munich. So, back home, we can see that the influence of Paris, Italy, and Munich is well reflected in his poetry. Eliot's career as a poet can be divided into three periods. The first one, which coincides with his studies in Boston and Paris, which culminated in the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. The second, which coincides with World War First and with financial and marital stress in his early lives, which culminated in The Wasteland. And the third, which coincides with its angst at the economic depression, the rise of Nazism, which culminates in Four Quatrains. So we see that love song of Prufrock, Wasteland, and Four Quatrains. These three works represent the three literary creative periods of Eliot's life. If we have to understand Eliot, we can read these three works and understand Eliot. The poems of first period, we see that they are preceded by a few exercises published in literary magazines when he wrote four poems: Portrait of a Lady, Preludes, Rhapsody, On a Windy Night, and Love Song. Now, these introduced him to themes which with variation and development. One of the most significant problem of isolation can be seen in these poems. In the Portrait of a Lady, we see that when a man and woman meet, but man is very inarticulate, imprisoned in his own thoughts, and this ironic dramatization of the conversational that happens, the woman speaks without thinking and man thinks without speaking, is also repeated in his works like Game of Chess and in The Wasteland. Now, besides being a poet, playwright, and publisher, we know that T S Eliot is one of the most seminal critics of his time. Since we are going to dedicate our next few classes and sessions on T S Eliot as a critic, and we'll be summarizing or analyzing his essay, Tradition and Individual Talent, we have to understand what type of a critic Eliot was. Carlo Leonti, who was an Italian critic, he found his poetry irrational and incomprehensible, and a magnificent puzzle. And he said that his poetic endeavors are deliberate critical purpose. So, in his literary criticism, Eliot's personality, critics say, that found its full expression. And his literary criticism is seen as an expression of his poetic credo. Now, one of the seminal critics of 20th century, Eliot is considered to be one of them. He showed a disinterested endeavor of critical faculty and we can say intelligence in analyzing the works of art. But again, for a very systematic discussion, we have to group his critical works under the following headings because that will be easier for us to understand. One was the theoretical criticism that dealt with the principles of literature. Second was the descriptive and practical criticism, which dealt with individual writers and evaluation of their achievements. Tradition and individual talent will be placed in the first category. And the last one was theological essays, his essays on Christianity and theology. So these were the three categories to understand Eliot as a critic